Welcome to another episode of the Let's Talk Universal podcast, where me and my guests talk about all things workforce with the aim of providing actionable insights and strategies for our community. And today we are talking about psychological safety in the workplace with Kylie Van Leeuwen, founder of Elevated Coaching and Consulting Global, international speaker, psychotherapist, emotional intelligence coach, NLP master practitioner, human rights consultant, and DEIAB specialist. Welcome, Kylie.
Thank you, Erica. So nice to be here.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you, and to have you with such a diverse list of, qualifications and experience there. So I think before we get started, it would be great if we could share with our audience sort of your background and the journey that you've taken to where you are today in the work that you do.
Sure. So it hasn't been linear. I think you reading that little intro out sort of demonstrates that. But my predominantly my background, as far as before I started the company, was about 15 years of being an executive and senior leader in the non-profit sector in Australia, and working a lot with people who are typically underrepresented in the workforce, including people living with disability, women, refugees, people of colour. So that's a little bit of, I guess, my background before launching Elevated Coaching Consulting 2.5 years ago, which I did in Sydney, Australia, which is where I'm from. And the reason I did that was I recognised there was a real gap in the consulting services offered to support nonprofits, because that was where I'd come from, but also supporting corporates. In my background in nonprofit, I worked a lot in the employment space, so helping those people from those, I guess, marginalised and underrepresented cohorts and groups and communities, and how as supporting them, and my teams would support them on their journey to sustainable, meaningful employment. So what I realised throughout that journey, and as I launched Elevated, which was, I guess, the reason why I launched Elevated, was I recognised there was a real gap in that consulting support for nonprofits, but also corporates, particularly with diversity, equity, inclusion, access and belonging. And so fast forward to then, and I decided that we needed to really, if we're going to enter the coaching and consulting space, because there's a million coaches and consultants, that we really needed to adopt a human rights and psychological lens to the consulting work, because that was part of the gap that I saw. And our coaching programs and services really focus on sustained behaviour change, and shifting mindset to empower and achieve that long-term change with our clients, whether that's coaching or consulting.
No, that's a really interesting, as you say, lens on what we see a lot of, as you say, consultants in this space. And actually, I'm really interested by this human rights lens as well. I wondered maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that, in terms of what exactly is different with a human rights lens in the work that you do.
So when we talk about diversity, equity and inclusion in the workplace, particularly, what I found as an executive, and then what I found as I did more work in the consulting space, is that if you talk to HR practitioners or diversity, equity, inclusion practitioners within a company, they usually will talk about the initiatives that they're running. So they will talk about disability awareness or disability inclusion. They might talk about things like events that they're holding throughout the year to celebrate things like Refugee Week, which we celebrate in Australia. And when we talk about a human rights lens, we look at the whole person. And when we go into to support an organisation with their diversity, equity, inclusion, access and belonging, and then the psychological safety space, what we do is we look at it through the human lens, the human rights lens, to make sure that every human being is included, respected, seen and heard, rather than focusing on particular groups of people. Because in my, I guess, my belief is that you have to make the workplace accessible and inclusive for all employees. Otherwise, it's not ever going to be truly inclusive, or it'll never truly be psychologically safe. It sounds like a lot, but when we talk about a human rights lens, we look at it through what are human rights, and to making sure that employers aren't breaching those. So things like workplace fairness, discrimination, harassment, including sexual harassment, looking at how we protect workers' rights when it comes to their psychological and mental health, but also looking at how we can coach leaders and train leaders to lead with more of a trauma-informed approach, so that they know how to lead people in their teams or in their organisations who are bringing their whole selves to work. And usually some of that, most of us have trauma and past experiences that are a part of who we are as human beings.
So let's talk about psychological safety a bit more, in terms of actually what is it? Could you define for us exactly what you mean by psychological safety?
Yeah, and what I usually do when I'm asked to define psychological safety is to differentiate between psychological safety and psychosocial safety, because people tend to use both terms interchangeably, and they are actually different. And then psychosocial hazards, which typically, if not managed appropriately, they turn into often psychological abuse or harm. So when we talk about psychological safety in the workplace, it's the right to feel safe at work. It's being able to speak up or speak out when you feel threatened or overwhelmed. People's workloads might be too overwhelming. They might not be able to feel like they can manage their current workload. But it's also knowing that you won't be punished, threatened, or embarrassed when you escalate those concerns. So we're not even talking about grievances. We're just talking about having conversations, perhaps with your manager or supervisor. And this is a psychological safe workplace is a culture where employees feel safe to take risks, they express their thoughts, and they can be themselves without fear of retribution. So that's what we refer to when we think about psychological safety. When we talk about psychosocial safety, that's when that's referring to a safe environment and organisational systems that are clear, easy to use, and supportive, and include safe social systems. So you're thinking people and relationships when you're talking about a workplace. And that's where we usually talk about psychosocial risks and hazards, which are negative factors that can harm employee health, well-being, and productivity. So the reason that I do that is because it's important, because both of these things, if managed and fostered correctly, they foster positive workplace cultures, trust, collaboration, innovation, all those things that we know make employees stay in organisations, but also make organisations and companies successful.
Yeah, and presumably there's kind of different strategies required for both of them that perhaps you can combine into one overriding, initiative, but actually, both need different strategies to manage. I don't know.
Yeah. They're interconnected for sure. There's lots of interdependencies. Usually you won't have a psychologically unsafe workplace, like one that's deemed by a psychologically unsafe workplace by a consultant like myself, without any psychosocial hazards. You can't have a whole bunch of risks and hazards, and particularly high risk, without then, and you wouldn't be able to turn around and assess that workplace as being completely psychologically safe.
Yeah, so
they lead to each other.
Yeah, so that's sort of why we get this whole like psychological safety being like the key, hot topic right now. So when it comes to this interest in psychological safety, this more general term of what it is, why do you think people are starting to really put a focus on this right now?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons, and that we could talk about that alone, I think, for a good hour. I think psychological safety has gained so much significant attention in recent years, particularly in the context of workplace wellness and team dynamics, because the incidence of workplace psychological abuse, harm, and injuries is really escalating, and that's on a global scale at the moment. And, yourself and myself and anybody who reads the news and, Harvard Business Review and publications like that, you see everywhere at the moment that employee health, well-being and workplace health and wellness and mental health are such a big focus for employers. And the reason for that is because the impact that it has on the company's bottom line. but also the impact it has on things like retention rates. We all know it's really hard not only to attract talent now, well, post-pandemic, I think, difficult to attract talent, but really difficult to retain talent as well. And so I think there's a more and more of a focus on psychological safety because it impacts companies' bottom line, retention rates, employee engagement and productivity, talent attraction and retention. And so organisations and leaders are starting, depending on what country you're in as well, and sort of the legislation around psychological safety and things like that. But I think a lot of organisations and leaders that will be successful and will thrive are those that are starting to connect the dots and are realising that fostering a psychologically safe workplace has so many positive impacts on all of these things, but it also supports the creation of inclusive workplaces. So you can't attempt to create a diverse and inclusive workplace without having, firstly, that focus on psychological safety, because, as we know, trying to attract and retain diverse talent, it requires, a psychologically safe workplace. The other reason is that in a lot of countries, and you and I talked about this briefly the other week, there is legislation to protect workers from psychological abuse and harm, like Australia, where I'm from. Employers and leaders are focusing more on psychological safety because they want to avoid liability and litigation. They don't want to, they don't want employers to bring workers' compensation claims and lawsuits upon them. Where I am now in the US, this isn't the case. There's no current legislation, and there never has been any legislation yet that protects workers from psychological abuse and harm. So there's no Workplace Psychological Safety Act in place in the United States yet. So bringing psychological safety awareness to legislators and policymakers and leaders is really critical to improve the workplace experience for people in countries like the US.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think a lot of what you're saying is resonating in terms of how do we connect this to what organizations really care about, which are obviously the employee retention and the having high performance teams within their organization by enabling them and allowing them to feel safe at work psychologically and emotionally and physically, all of those great things. But I suppose my question to you is, if there's an organizational leader who perhaps is in the US, there's no real regulation around this, and you're trying to, or someone is trying to convince them that psychological safety is a business imperative, how might you phrase that to them?
Well, that's where the human rights approach sort of comes in. We firstly say it. I always say to clients or potential clients and legislators now, do it because it's the right thing to do. Firstly, if you're thinking about human rights, breaching somebody's psychological safety, that's a breach of somebody's human rights. We all have a right to feel safe in our workplace, our place of work. So that's the first thing I say is forget what's right for the business for a moment and do what's right for the human beings in your organisation. But psychological safety, that's a part of what we do, is building the awareness around how it directly impacts employee well-being. The talent attraction and retention, which we know are real pain points for employers and organisations, but also showing them the bigger picture around things like what you said, the team performance and how it's all linked to organisational success. And one of the things that we talk about is by fostering a culture of psychological safety, organisations can improve employee engagement, enhance innovation and collaboration. If people aren't feeling psychologically safe, they tend to shut down as human beings. They don't collaborate, they don't speak up, they don't contribute or participate. But it's also creating a more inclusive work environment, which then leads to higher productivity, lower turnover rates, and a stronger competitive advantage in the market. So it's piecing it all together for the leaders and the organisations and then the teams, and to say, this is psychological safety and this is the business imperative and this is all the ways that can impact all of your people, but also your success as a leader, especially if it's a CEO we're speaking to, because the buck stops with them. Mm-hmm. But it's not just, again, I'll say it again, it's not just a moral imperative, but it is a strategic one that can drive that long-term sustainability and growth for a company. It can be the make or break a lot of the time now.
Yeah, no, and I think, as you say, the business case for it is incredibly strong. And sometimes it is piecing together yes, it's a great thing to do, and that's the main point of all this, but actually, there is a business need and a business case for this as well. It's a valuable argument to be making.
Yeah.
But in terms of what you're seeing happening right now in businesses, and this is probably a bit of a general sweep, because I don't know if perhaps it's different dependent on industry or geography, but what do you think organizations are getting seriously wrong when it comes to this?
Their lack of awareness, I think, starting a lot of the time, leaders don't know. And again, you're right, it does depend on where, geography. So in the States, this is, although the term psychological safety was actually coined in the United States, because there's no legislation and it hasn't really been highlighted legally, it is becoming a term that's starting to be used more, but leaders still aren't familiar with it or the importance of fostering psychological safety. So organisations that we typically work with, that are getting it wrong, if you like, but they often struggle with workplace psychological safety due to, I guess, several challenges. And this is regardless of industry or geography. So again, quite general, but one key issue is the lack of awareness or understanding of what psychological safety entails and its importance. So all of those things we talked about before, how wide-reaching it is and its impact if you have a psychologically unsafe workplace. And so this can lead to employers and leaders unknowingly creating environments that are stifling things like innovation and collaboration and effective communication. But some leaders that we're finding, again, particularly in the US, are fearful of addressing psychological abuse or psychosocial hazards, either because they think it might be safer to turn a blind eye. Sadly, that's some of what we're hearing from some of the testimony that we're gathering, or it's because they, regardless of what level of management or the maturity of the leader, they've not been properly trained to know how to recognise and address psychological abuse or the signs that someone's experiencing psychological harm. And another common issue is not recognising the role that leaders play in fostering psychological safety. So leaders who lack emotional intelligence, we find that, it never ceases to amaze me when some executives and CEOs are either tolerating psychological abuse or turning a blind eye, or themselves are the perpetrators. So it's typically those with quite low emotional intelligence that we find that with. But the other challenge is that there's this assumption for those that are familiar or somewhat familiar with the term and concept of psychological safety. There's this assumption that it's solely a HR issue or responsibility, rather than, a shared commitment and responsibility across all levels of the organisation. So it does vary depending on country, region, and industry. And we do a lot of work with trades, both here in the United States and in Australia, around connecting women into trade careers and STEM careers. And so you can imagine that where we're really starting from basics there around how psychological safety looks for women, to attract and retain women in trade careers. But they're, I guess, some of the key things that we do see in our work.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting that actually, on behalf of the leaders themselves, there's almost this holdback and this fear, because the words harm and abuse sound really serious. And I think perhaps they think by acknowledging that there is harm and abuse, that they're in some way liable or at risk of I don't know, legal action or, and I feel that maybe that's one of the major holdbacks really for people, particularly in the US where it's not regulated, to actually, take action on it.
Yeah. So I think what we'll see is when the first Workplace Psychological Safety Act it moves through, it's with Senate in Michigan at the moment. Hopefully it's passed very shortly. typically what we see and what I've heard from the Americans that I'm doing this work with is once one state passes a bill like this, it then flows through to others. People are starting to make a lot of noise now because the incidence of psychological injury in workplaces in the United States is really escalating to the point where people are unable to work for years. We've had a lot of people take their own lives because of psychological abuse in the workplace here and globally. We also saw that in Australia, unfortunately, quite a lot. But it's getting a lot of media attention. So it's one of those things where people have to realise that it's a problem, but it's a problem we can address. There are things that we can do, and they're quite simple things that can be done to address these things and stop these, incidences of psychological harm and abuse happening in the workplace and people, never working again or taking early retirement.
Yeah, and I wonder if, this emotional intelligence piece really interests me because, a lot of management are promoted into management based on the roles that they were in prior and the performance in those particular roles. And so those people management skills aren't necessarily, inherited by just taking up that role. And actually, I don't know what your perspectives are on, middle management training and building in, emotional intelligence courses into that. What's your perspective on this?
Well, we do coaching, and we've got a whole coaching program, a leadership development program around that. And the reason for that is we see, like you said, a lot of subject matter experts in organizations, either because they're really good and they have a really particular skill set and they're good at that job, they're escalated up the chain either because of that or because of years of tenure. So you see people say, I'm a CEO or I'm an executive general manager. And you say, okay, well, like, what qualifications have you got? They say, I've been here 20 years. And I think, no, it doesn't make you a leader. And so we do a lot of emotional intelligence training because pretty much every skill that you require to be a very effective, strong, empathetic leader and a successful leader, where you will lead your team in a way that they're also successful, but also you have the emotional intelligence skills to know how to foster a psychologically safe workplace. Sometimes that needs to be taught or highlighted to people that don't naturally have that awareness or those skills. Some people can't be taught. Unfortunately, they're better being a subject matter expert and not being people leaders. It's just, I very much believe that leadership has a lot to do with personality traits and just intrinsically who you are as a human being. So sometimes it's refining and building awareness, and sometimes it's really building awareness that perhaps leadership isn't the right role for you. And we have had instances where people have gone through the training and gone, yeah, I think I'm not doing, justice to this role. I think I need to step down.
Yeah, I'm just in my head. I've got so many managers that I've had in the past, or even, my husband's had in the past, and it's just like they could have really done or do with some, emotional intelligence training or just something else for them to really understand what it means to lead people without, those having that impact on them and their lives. So when it comes to psychosocial hazards, which is a new term for me. How does that, what examples are there of what psychohazards actually are? And then how do they kind of go on to impact the workforce?
So it's funny. I'm trying to think about, what are some of the most common ones that we see? Because I think during COVID or during the pandemic, and then, since we've all experienced, some of us have experienced working remotely, working from home, I think that one of the most common psychosocial hazards that we see, and we hear from both leaders, but also team members that we're working with, is inappropriate or unreasonable workloads. That's really common. And people usually start with, I'm feeling burnt out. It's like, okay, let's just go back a couple of steps. So I would say inappropriate or unreasonable workloads, which then has a risk of leading to burnout. So that's a huge problem globally now, and that's why I think that people are talking more and more about employee health and well-being. So creating a workplace culture where employees feel safe to speak up and raise this issue with their manager without fear of punishment, losing their job, being demoted, discriminated against, that's crucial. And employees need to be provided with the opportunities to raise these concerns in a safe and private space with their supervisor or their manager about excessive workloads and how to resolve the problem. And often when I say that to leaders, when they say we're experiencing, a disconnect or employees aren't engaged, or our employee engagement survey said that people aren't really engaged at work, but, we're seeing productivity. And I always say, but you won't forever. People will either continue working that hard and tolerating those workloads out of fear, but they will burn out and you will harm people. And so the first thing that I say is, how often are you as a leader giving your team members the opportunity to come together regularly as a group, but also how often are you giving them your time where they can access you as their leader one-on-one? And they're like, oh, they know they can come to me anytime. And I'm like, no, you need to have scheduled one-on-ones. Like, it's best practice. It's leadership 101, right? But a lot of leaders, because they're time poor and they're also busy, like the workload cascades down typically. So that would be one thing that I would say. But that, when we talk about giving people the opportunity and giving them your time so that they can share these things, that's a part of building trust and rapport. That involves the leader establishing a culture where, all their employees or team members feel seen, supported, heard, and where there's open and effective communication. But when we talk about addressing psychosocial hazards in the workplace, I think it's crucial for promoting a healthy and productive workforce. If people are escalating concerns or mentioning their concerns to their leader about things like this particular psychosocial hazard, workload, and nothing's being done or they see no action, then they typically retreat and withdraw. And the trust in their leader starts to erode. People think, well, he or she's not doing anything about it. And so the way that they can change these is, measures such as conducting risk assessments, promoting work-life balance. I don't like work-life balance because it's kind of, it implies this. It's more work-life harmony. But providing support and training as well for managers, like we were talking about, emotional intelligence training or other types of training, so that the managers can understand how to foster open, a culture of open communication and support. So then the team members can come to them and talk about psychosocial hazards like this that can be resolved quite quickly if there's that opportunity to do it.
Yeah, and I think the point that is really kind of standing out to me in all of this is actually, organizations want high performance teams, but in fact it's generally the high performance individuals that struggle the most and, as you say, experience burnout. And so it's almost as if we're saying, okay, well, you want high performance teams, then you really need to have these measures in place to make sure that everyone feels psychologically safe.
Yeah. And just to add to what you said, I think it's really important to mention that the high performers, our conversations when we have coaching sessions with people who have been high performers, experienced burnout or a psychological injury, and they come to us because they're needing career coaching to get back on the horse, so to speak, it could be years. Or it could be a couple of months of intensive coaching. One of the things that I'm finding over the last, almost 3 years is that the high performers are the ones that are constantly given more work because they're seen as so competent and so capable. And I saw it as a leader. I was a high performer, and my peers as well. And we were constantly piled on, even though we kept saying, we can't, we're drowning. And we all left that organisation due to psychological injuries. and different psychological injuries. But what we find is the high performers, instead of leaders nurturing them and recognizing the value they bring, they just, will give them the work of others who are either lower performing or very mediocre performers, rather than addressing underperformance with those people and then continue to nurture the high performers. So I did want to mention that, because if there's any leaders listening, it's really important to recognize, addressing performance concerns and managing performance effectively with those that might be underperforming, rather than ignoring that and then risking the psychological health of your high performers, because you'll be left with the mediocre ones when all the high performers leave.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very interesting point to highlight to people, and valuable one. I just wondered if we could maybe just flip this around for a second. So what is the impact on their business if they don't do anything about this?
Wow, there's a lot. They will, well, apart from, I guess let's start at what typically will happen. People leave the organisation. Depending on what country you're in, you'll leave the organisation and submit a workers' compensation claim for a psychological injury, or not. But either way, you've got people leaving in droves. So your retention rates will suffer. That'll be the first thing. Then what happens is, you only need one person to tell another person about their experience, their poor workplace experience. Your brand starts to suffer. Your reputation as an employer, whatever your company is, that will suffer. So then your attraction and, your talent acquisition and your attraction, that'll start to falter. People will see your job ads and go, oh, that's that company that my friend, I've heard that, stories about it. You get bad reviews on Glassdoor and other sites, because people are becoming very savvy about really being careful about the workplace culture that they enter into and commit to. So they do their research before they even go to interviews now. So there are a few of the things, but then the other things are, you may not be compliant with the regulations and legislation around worker rights and worker protection, so general protections like we have in Australia, or industrial relations legislation. So then that leads to not only, again, brand damage and reputational damage, but potential lawsuits, lots of money being paid out. My experience in Australia is I've seen a lot of the same companies popping up when people come to us and need us to support them through, a workers' compensation claim or a Fair Work Australia claim for bullying or harassment. And you see the same company names coming up over and over. And I say to my team all the time, I'm not sure how these employers, because a lot of them are non-profits, how can they afford to be paying out these claims? Like, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's those things that they can escalate very quickly. When I left the organisation I was at, there was about 8 people that followed in very swift succession. And what happened was the brand got damaged. The CEO's reputation was damaged. People are talking about that organisation in a not great way now. They're not an employer of choice, but it costs them a lot of money, because people were and still are on, income protection or workers' compensation, and it's not good. It's not good all round. It tarnishes the brand and the reputations of not just the organisation, but the leaders that have been involved in it.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, is that, when we talk about anything within this diversity, equity and inclusion umbrella, it's like, well, the risks, they're not worth it. And actually, the benefits definitely outweigh, any investment financially that you have to make into these initiatives or programs. It makes good business sense, and not just it's the right thing to do. So what would you say is the most important thing that organizations need to realize about psychological safety and these psychosocial hazards in their workplace?
That they can't thrive and succeed without it. They can't. If you think as a leader, CEO, even a team leader, because you're still responsible for leading people, that your leadership style doesn't need to change and evolve to a point where you can confidently say, I know I can foster and do foster every day in this role a psychologically safe and inclusive workplace, if you can't say that and you believe that you can continue on and you yourself be successful in your role and the organisation can thrive and succeed in the absence of psychological safety, you're really wrong. And it may take a little while, but you will find out just how detrimental it can be, especially long term. People might do their jobs, like I said, for a while. That's usually under duress and out of fear, but eventually people will leave and all those things will start happening that we were just talking about. And again, it's thinking about human beings. You know, we're talking about people that are like our sister, parents, kids, our children, if we have children. You know, they're human beings that if you can sit down at the end of the day and say, I think I did something wrong today as a leader, or I think that this culture that we're building collectively here it's not nurturing the human beings that work here. And we're seeing people leave, and I'm hearing whispers of people, you know, with anxiety and depression and whatever other psychological injuries they might be dealing with. It's your job to speak up about it, and to do something. You know, we say, if you see something, say something. So I would say that, but also from a legal standpoint, you might be in breach of those workplace rights, compliance and regulations. So it's not worth it. But my message would be, you can't succeed and thrive as a leader individually. Your team can't succeed and thrive, but your organisation can't either if you don't have a psychologically safe workplace.
Yeah. And I think that's really coming across, you know, that it's that actually, and I think this is my next question, is who exactly is responsible for initiating this in an organization? Because we've kind of said, well, it's not just an HR problem and it's, you know, everyone has a responsibility, but who is that person that really kind of spearheads this?
So the leaders, if we go in and we have an initial consultation with an organization, I usually always say, I have to speak to the CEO and the senior leadership team, whoever the C-suite is, because they are responsible for initiating it and driving it, and they have to walk the talk for it to work. Because then what happens is, as you know, is it's a big change management journey then. And as we know, because we've both been employees look at their leader for direction, for vision. So they're looking for someone to steer the ship. So it has to be led by the leaders. They need to drive the change. They need to communicate the importance of why they're changing, what's the why behind the change. And then it's the responsibility of all staff, not just the leaders and HR once, you know, that journey has begun and that change management has started. It's the responsibility of every single staff member to understand what it means to foster a psychologically safe environment. And what are some of those behaviours at an individual level that need to improve or stop altogether?
Yeah. So when it comes to sort of those first steps, if there's an organization or someone within an organization who identifies that psychological safety is a problem or that they need to do something about it, what is your recommendation as to first steps on that journey towards becoming more psychologically safe for their workforce?
Rather than doing a survey, unless you've done an employee engagement one and it's really bad, is really sit and reflect as leaders and observe around the communication. So can you sit and observe and say hand on heart that you have fostered an environment, a workplace culture, an environment where open communication is the norm? Because it starts with communication. I would say you have to foster open communication, and that involves, you know, encouraging employees to share their thoughts, their ideas, and their concerns without fear of reprisal. When we talk about psychological safety and this particular part of the journey, this beginning stage, we have a lot of leaders saying, "But how do we foster?" Trust and rapport. How do we build that? Because, you know, our employee engagement survey said that 90% of our staff don't trust their leaders. And that's where we bring in the positive psychology side of how we coach and consult. We teach them how to build trust among teams, leaders, because without trust and building that trust, the change management journey will just stop, and you won't be able to reach the end. So we talk to them a lot about building trust and rapport. The other thing is leaders who genuinely give their time to their teams and listen, they will build trust and rapport the fastest, because people who feel like they're seen and heard, they start to connect with their leaders. And I've received that sort of feedback as a consultant, but also as a leader. People will thank you. I know you're really busy, but thanks so much for that 10 minutes on the phone just to talk through some of the things that I'm concerned about. And that 10 minutes as a leader can mean the difference between that person leaving or quietly quitting, or getting off the phone to you or leaving that meeting with you and saying, okay, I feel heard, I feel seen and respected, and my issues have been resolved, and getting on with their job and then actually going above and beyond in their role. So the other thing I would say is building an awareness and understanding of what psychological safety is, and how psychosocial hazards and risks can lead to psychological harm, abuse, and importance. Because if people don't understand what you're trying to achieve on this big, long, I think it's going to be forever, the journey. It never really ends. But if they don't understand what it is you're trying to achieve as a leader, they just won't go on that journey with you. So I think part of that building awareness of what it is and why we're working on this together as teams and individuals, and why we're all responsible, a part of that is probably providing some training on topics, like cultural awareness and empathy and, conflict resolution and how to treat human beings respectfully when we're in the workplace.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing those. It's really interesting because it sounds so human. Like it's just bringing the human back into the workplace. And Ian, the chairman of the UWI, talks about a lot how in business we have this way of describing how businesses work as a machine, and people have taken on this role as a cog in the machine, but actually now we need to switch that around, and we can't keep thinking about it in that way, because it doesn't allow us to be I don't know, flexible as businesses, and productive, and all of those things. So yeah, no, great stuff. And before we finish, I also wanted to bring up something that we spoke about previously, because I found it really interesting, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about what it actually was. And this was a problem that you'd identified, which was this intersection between disability services and culturally responsive practice. Can you just elaborate on what that is and what you mean? What problem did you find?
So what we've found, and I'll give an example. So in Australia, there is a national federally funded program called Disability Employment Services. It's currently under review, which is wonderful, because the department, the Department of Social Services, the federal department in Australia, has recognised, and other stakeholders, that it's just not working. It's not as effective as it could be. So they're reviewing it at the moment, which is exciting. But almost, if we look at the national caseload of people on the Disability Employment Services program in Australia, you find that almost 20% of the participants in that program identify as culturally and linguistically diverse. Yet they're one of the groups in the program with the lowest training and employment outcomes, because the program wasn't designed in a culturally responsive way, and it's not entirely accessible to people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds for a number of reasons. Part of the reason there's so many parts to it, but having delivered that program myself for many, many years in Australia, part of the reason that I saw is that the staff delivering that program, and others now that we're in the States as well, and we're talking to disability support services here, a lot of the staff that work in that program, they don't have the knowledge or the background to properly and effectively support people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Either they don't share the same culture, or they haven't been trained in cultural awareness or culturally responsive practice. So what we see is people in Australia, but also in the United States, accessing these services, people living with a disability, and the person that comes to their home to support them, or that their consultant that sits with them to try and find them a job, doesn't have an understanding of how to deliver the disability support or the disability employment support in a way that is either culturally responsive or culturally sensitive, and so the supports, it's not speaking to the individual that's accessing the service. So the intersection, when we talk about that intersectionality, the intersection between disability services and culturally responsive practice, it refers to the recognition and integration of cultural diversity within the framework of disability support. And it involves understanding and respecting, the unique cultural differences, backgrounds, beliefs, norms and values of individuals with disabilities and their communities. And I've had a long conversations with a number of disability support services here in the US. And when I've talked about culturally responsive practice, it's not really a term that's used in the United States. It's more of an Australian term. But when I've explained it to them, they're like, oh, yeah, I understand, because we have a huge group of people, either people of colour or, people from a Spanish or Hispanic background on our caseload. And when we send our support workers out, they're not getting outcomes. And the people are requesting people from the same cultural background that have an understanding of what their culture means to them. And part of that is psychological safety, because if you're not having people that reflect the similar or same cultural background and have an understanding of what those cultural backgrounds are and beliefs, it's really difficult to build trust and rapport with someone. And so if you can't build trust and rapport with someone who is living with a disability from a different cultural background to you, then it's really difficult for you to create a safe space for that person, for them to engage with you, to then find them a job. Like, it's just this process. So that's why it's really hard for providers that aren't recognising this when they're hiring their own disability support staff. They need to have staff that represent their clientele to get the outcomes for those people living with a disability that are their clients.
And then just so I understand, so when it comes to organisations, how does that then impact them? What's that knock-on effect?
Well, they're not either. They're in Australia, for instance, the disability support services or the providers of those services, they're paid for the outcomes that they achieve for the people living with disability on their caseload. What you're finding, though, is those outcomes just aren't being achieved because the clients aren't connecting with their support worker or their employment consultant, and they're either lacking motivation, they feel like they're not understood, they're getting frustrated, and so unless the organisation that's delivering the services recognise, well, hold on a minute, we've done an analysis of our caseload, and the data shows that 20% of our caseload accessing our disability support services are actually people who identify as Hispanic, but we've got no Hispanic workers. Maybe that's where the disconnect is. So we talk to people about you have to, people want to work with people like them because it helps them feel understood, helps them feel seen. They sometimes, people from different cultural backgrounds, they'll say, I want someone who's Italian because, we can talk speak in Italian, and straight away they're already, 5 appointments ahead than if they were dealing with me, who speaks no Italian despite being married to an Italian. So it helps people connect better. And when you're connected to your, support worker or your social worker or your employment consultant, what we see is this huge amount of trust, and then that's when those outcomes are achieved for that person.
And what do you think is the potential solution to this problem? Because it's something that you're noticing now and identifying now, but what do you think that solution to the problem might be?
Well, it's building awareness of the intersection first, because a lot of providers, they're focused so much on being a disability support service or a settlement service. So if we sort of separate the culture and the disability out for a minute, they're so focused on the services they provide. So either they're a settlement service and they're providing services to help refugees settling in the US or in Australia, or they're a disability support service and they're providing different supports to people living with a disability. It's about building that awareness that, so what are you going to do if you have somebody coming to settle in Australia or in Sydney or where I'm in Virginia in the United States, and they are a refugee with a disability? How do you support that person? Human beings are multifaceted, right? We all have multiple identities that make us who we are. And it's the same for disability support services. It's saying, how do you support people from different cultural backgrounds when your staffing, your personnel, they don't reflect your clientele? So how do you expect your clientele to engage and trust when they don't see themselves in the people that are supporting them in their homes often, that's a really intimate personal space for people. They want to feel that they can trust these people, because without trust, and that's the whole positive psychology that comes into it as well, is how can you expect to build trust and rapport if people they don't feel that their culture is being seen or respected, or their cultural beliefs, things like that. So it's, for us, to answer your question, it's about asking questions like that I've just sort of posed as an example, is how would you support these people? Are your disability support services culturally accessible, but also culturally responsive? And that always is followed by, what does that mean? And so we talk about, doing some training, do some cultural awareness training rather than just disability awareness and inclusion training, because then you're meeting the needs of a much bigger group of people.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Kylie. I just wanted to revisit that because I was so interested by it when we last spoke. But just quickly before we finish, I just wanted to bring up the programs that you have. So you have the Elevated Workplace Training Program in partnership with Workplace Fairness, and there's also the Elevated Mindset 8-week coaching program. Briefly, who are these courses for? What do they do, and where can they go to get the information?
So they're all on our website. Elevated Workplace is a beautiful partnership and a training program that we co-designed with a nonprofit based in DC called Workplace Fairness. And what we recognised was there was a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion programs, like training programs for leaders and teams out there, but there wasn't any that actually included the psychological safety element to DEI, and also the worker rights and fairness. So what we wanted was to build a training program that encompassed all of those things around worker rights, workplace fairness, diversity, equity, inclusion, and psychological safety. And so Elevated does the DEI psychological safety part, and our beautiful partners over at Workplace Fairness, they're all lawyers and very, very smart people when it comes to the legislation and employment laws and protections here in the US. So we deliver that program nationally across the United States with them. And I actually have a webinar coming up on Thursday at lunchtime where people can just hear a bit more about what that training involves. And the Elevated Mindset program is that's our big program. That was our first one that we ever designed. And that is a 8-week program for anybody, regardless of what their goals are, when it comes to shifting their mindset, identifying and addressing the limiting beliefs they might have. It can take you in various directions depending on what your goals are, but it's a combination of various modalities, neuro-linguistic programming. There's a lot of psychology obviously in there, but also neuroscience. And it's a really powerful and impactful program for people who have got to a point where they're fed up, either with, diet and exercise, or their career journey, or just knowing they need to make a change in how they live their life and how they think about things, and their routines and behaviours, but have been unable to successfully do that on their own. So that's our other program.
Amazing stuff. And we'll, of course, provide the links to those on the podcast webpage. But Kylie, thank you so much for sharing all of the things that we've spoken about today, psychological safety, the social hazards. It's been incredibly interesting. And I've personally learned a lot. So I hope our listeners have as well. But yeah, it's been wonderful chatting to you. And I look forward to seeing where else your work takes you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been awesome.